to me grind. Take down the film watchers and nerds all at once.
You there? Hello? Hey, how you doing? Want to talk about a running back? I kind of want to talk about a running back. So let's do that, I guess. Kenny Gainwell. Some in our community have taken him to call him Kenneth because they're college people and all fancy and stuff. No, Ray GQ from the Dynasty Destination podcast and YouTube show and other stuff, I'm sure. Definitely check him out here on YouTube. He's doing some great film content. He's talked about Kenny a little bit. I haven't seen him do a specific video on him, but he's mentioned him a few times. Like he's too afraid or something. I don't know what it is. I really like Kenny Gainwell's 1 year of production. I think it's pretty interesting. I talked about him with Zach Reed from the Dynasty Dummies podcast on our live stream on, depending on when you're watching this video, it would be different. But it was a Tuesday, and it was yesterday for me. Just throwing it out there. If you want to go check it out, it's probably like in my past videos or something. But anyway, I really like him, and there's a lack of prospects at running back in this class to really like. Now, I haven't really dug down into the depths. I know of some really interesting names, like Jamar Jefferson's a really good one. Obviously, you've got Etney and Najee Harris at the top of the class, pretty much set in stone at this point, which makes it boring. So Kenny is just a little more interesting in a class that's kind of thin and has a lot of older prospects coming out, which is fine at running back, to be honest with you. But yeah, let's talk about the wild card. Let's talk about the guy you don't know about. How about it? Sound good? Cool. All right. So what's the problem with Kenny? Why does no one mention him as the best prospect in this class? A few different reasons. One, he's coming from what is his conference actually? The American West. He played for Memphis in he played 2 years, but one of the years he basically didn't have any role, didn't get on the field much in his second year. He basically got the job straight away, and then he chose not to play. I think he got injured, and then he chose not to play in 2020 because of a very sad personal story, which is worth looking into, but I don't know these people. I don't know these guys as people, or really as football players. I knew as statistical stat lines, and I don't want to pretend like we're talking about them. We should be devastatingly interested in them, which is why I know a lot about Kenny G, but I'm trying to separate out his stats and his on-field stats from the person, because I think they're two different things. I like to separate them out. I like to be fans of players and not fans or fans of statistical stat lines. Like, as people, I'm fans of everyone, obviously. So I would look him up, but I'm not the place to really get into the who's blue collar, who slept in the car, who lost an extraordinarily large amount of family members to COVID recently. So I definitely remember checking that out, but we're sticking on stats, all right? So, yeah, the 1 year he did play, he was basically, he had one of the best single seasons of anyone in this class, and a season that actually stacks up really well to a players from most classes, depending on what you like to look at. And now my running back pre-draft model, specifically now, since we don't get combine information, I switched everything over to basically looking at conference team adjusted and looking at best and average and some various other stats. And you can see all of that in my database. You can see the exact formula and stats I'm looking at. But I don't want to get too nerdy with you here on YouTube. But you can definitely see it if you want. And it's basically meant to assess how productive they were in their situation, adjusted for the situation they were playing in, and how well that compares to past prospects. That's what all my pre-draft models try to do. And yeah, it measures up pretty well. Now, if you want to look at one single stat that's got a pretty good correlation to fantasy points in the NFL, one that I like a lot is actually adjusted yards per team attempt. Now, it's actually weighted yards per team attempt. It's a stat Anthony Amico put me on. If you don't follow him at Mixer on Twitter, you should. He's actually a football coach instead of like a fake fantasy football player like me. And knows more about statistics than I'll ever do. And I was really struggling with running back, especially taking out combine weighting for this year's class. And he put me onto it. Now, I say it's technically weighted because essentially you just give extra points to receiving yards over rushing yards, because receiving yards are just innately more valuable for our thing, for fantasy. And actually, it seems to turn out on the field, receiving yards are actually more valuable to a team in terms of moving it down the field so you can, score touchdowns. And I think that's the goal in football. I don't even know, really. But yeah, ignoring all of that, you weight receiving yards. Now, what I did with that stat was then adjust it by conference. So if you're playing in a conference where running back typically gets like a whole bunch of yards as the running back one, say it's an easy conference or a low defensive conference or the Cursor West or whatever, it's different than playing the ACC Atlantic division or whatever. So I looked at the average of what a running back one does in that division, in terms of weighted yards per team attempt, and then see how well they compare to it. Now, in his best season, which is also really his only season, his yards above the conference average was 1.8. It's in there, but let's not. Now, that actually ranks in the top 10 all-time as a single season, going back all the way to 2000. The other names that turn up on that list are actually pretty interesting. There's a few busts, but there's also like Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, a lot of good players. But that's why you don't just look at one thing. All I'm pointing out is that in that stat, that's actually pretty good at measuring how well they were, and I have adjusted it by the conference he was playing in, so the American West, taking some of that variance out. He was really good across that one stat. Now, the thing is, he was actually good across most stats in that single season. We'll get into a breakdown of how he's producing it later. But his statistics look good in that single season. And at running back, as I recently wrote up for Jordan McNamara's, what is it called? Dynasty of Analytics. He's doing a new edition. He asked me to write the rookie, what stats matter and what stats matter for what kind of a chapter. And the starting rule you should think about in rookie prospecting. Not the only rule, because as we'll see as we dig into different prospects, you have to take the individual player and what their career in college brought them. If they only play 1 year, like Kenny Gainwell, you have to know you're comparing something different than if you're comparing it to someone like Derrick Henry, who played 2 years, dominated one full year, but wasn't injured and didn't opt out another year. That's slightly different context, right? Or you look at an Etne or a Gainwell, know that they played 4 years all the way there for 4 years in college. Etne played pretty much a very large role from the very start, but not the full role until the last 2 years. And Gainwell pretty much had no role until the last 2 years when he dominated the positional opportunity more than Etne or more than Gainwell did in his one season. So we're not comparing apples to apples exactly, but pretend we are. And what pretending we are does for us, it tells us that with rookie prospect evaluation for running backs, it's okay, much more so at running back, to look at their best season. Now, often that also is synonymous with their last season, because senior difference is a thing. And once you hit a certain place in your career, if a team likes you or someone else gets drafted to the NFL, you kind of get bequeathed the opportunity to try and earn the opportunity, is perhaps a way of looking at it. You're the next guy up. And at that point, you know the role and the team and the schemes much more than most players just coming onto the team. Happens at wide receiver, happens at running back. But with running back, where there's so little opportunity to force the issue yourself. Running backs who aren't the guy are more often on the bench than wide receivers who could be on the field if they're not the guy that year, and therefore you can force the amount of opportunity. You can create yourself a little bit more at wide receiver than running back. And all of this boils down to meaning Kenny Gainwell having one season isn't the worst thing, especially just at running back. Essentially, it just means he's got less wear and tear on his body if you want to run into some narratives real quick, but we don't have to go to narratives just yet. It's just, he had a really good season that compares statistically well to most players that do well in the NFL, and we can compare evenly to players that didn't, to all players, because most of the time, it's okay to just look at their best season and sometimes adjusting it for their last season as well, because it's nice to see progression. The team didn't just have one spike year, and so that's why last comes up. Now, average does help out, so look at the average of their stats over the course of their college career. That does help out at running back too. Again, we shouldn't look at one thing. I really kind of advocate, if I advocate for anything, a more holistic view, taking in everything they did as much as you can, one stat at a time, 1 year at a time, however you prefer, one game at a time. If you watch these things, watch them create the stats on the field, I guess. They're just stat generation engines, really, obviously. But, but definitely take a holistic view. It's not just what they did in one thing, one time, or 1 year. Get an understanding of what these players are, and then you can have an opinion on them that's actually based on something, and then we can put them into context of the value of drafting them, or the landing spot, or the draft round. So that's, if I have something I advocate for, that's what I do. Get a good idea of what works, and then go look at this individual context, this individual person, and the career that played out for them. So outside of that, it's all that's my way of saying it's okay that I just have to look at 1 year for Gainwell, specifically because that 1 year he did get the role, and he did play well in that role, and so we can compare it to other players from this draft class and previous draft classes with some little mental notes that, you know, his average is going to look weird. And stuff like that. But let's see what I'm talking about. In fact, let's do the negatives, right? I've talked to Zach Reed. I've taken in some external information. What's not to like? Why might he not be good in the NFL? Well, there's a few different reasons. Starting from the top, the American West barely gets drafted. It's got like 1.5% of players drafted by the NFL come from that conference, which is actually a really low rate. And even when you consider that most conferences really only get between 4 and 6% of players drafted, most come from the SEC West, even at running back. And if you want to see that breakdown, it's in the positional tab per player, but you can also see just all conferences listed in the conference tab. And I'm not selling you like it sounds like, oh, and make sure you go check out my course. No, I'm collecting it, and I get to collect so much of it because people help me out with it, because it's really tedious to collect, and I'm willing to do the tedious work of collecting it and lining it up neatly. And so some actual nerd wizards help me out doing that, and it's kind of all on the basis of that way we all get to look at it. So it's free. It's just pinned everywhere I have a timeline. You can just go look at it and download it, and you can see everything I'm talking about. And yeah, all I ask is you check out the sources tab for the wizards who actually help me to put it together, because they're the ones putting in the skill and the talent to create it. So I'm not like every time I refer to my database, I feel like I'm like selling you. I'm not. It's just I collect it all there. You can go look, fact check me, you know. And you can fact check me because it's not on 7 different websites, and that's the whole point of it. We're pulling it together. But moving on. Anyway, the conference isn't well liked by the NFL. We can't expect a lot of draft capital. That's the first real problem, and that's in this little tab here, the drafted rate and also the hit rate. And you can see that even though 1.5% of players since 2000 have been drafted from his conference, 0 have hit. None have had a top 24 season. That's not encouraging. So that's the first problem you should know. He's not coming from a place where you can expect draft capital. Now, hopefully, and I've done some podcasts on this, the NFL does a decent job of adjusting to where talent is. So we could dig back through that conference and see if there were any prospects that came from it that actually turned out to be good, and then adjust for if the NFL just has a bias against this conference, or if genuinely there haven't been many positive running backs coming from this class, and that's why, and we can gain more context. And mostly I think it's just a low drafted conference. I think good players exist everywhere, but I'm a big fan of what should we call them this time? The underdog story. I love undrafted guys. I love guys coming from low drafted conferences. It's kind of my thing. You should probably know that before I talk more about Gainwell. So that's the first thing you should know about. Second problem, the kind that Ray GQ would hate. No, not really. But he's tiny. He's a tiny guy. What do I mean by that? Good question. And the next person that says he's small, you should really ask for specifics on that. And I'll point out why in a second, specifically with Gainwell. But what concerns me is when I was talking to Zach, it showed up in his film of, and I trust Zach, and I know he does a good job, and so does Ray GQ when they're watching the tape. So when he says something with almost out thinking it, that he's a smaller guy, he's not good in pass protection, it doesn't mean he's a smaller guy. To me, what it means is he's playing that way. That's actually a concern even for a nerd like me who, obviously doesn't even watch football. The fact that that's sticking out to someone who's doing a very good, honest process on film evaluation, that means no matter what his size is, he's coming across as small. Now, is he actually small? I don't know. I don't have combine stats. But I have done a Google search. I know he's listed right now in and around 5'11", or around 71 inches tall, depending on how you want to look at it. And I think Zach told me he's around 190, 196 pounds. I didn't Google that one. But here's the thing. What do you mean by small? Because if we go with the 71 height criteria, there's actually like a lot of players that are that tall who are good and bad, and it's pretty typical height. Now, if we go for under 200 pounds, that's where the list gets smaller, and that's where I want to start. If you go by BMI, which is a calculation using the 2, well, then you're a heathen. But also, yeah, it gets in and around that 30 number is where most running backs fall. But I want to stick to height with you for a second, because if we look at running backs with top 24 seasons in the NFL who have under 200 pounds. Now, I think all of this is kind of a narrative, in that it's something that sounds true, but kind of unsupported, in that we think big guys are more likely to survive the running back position. But when I listen to running backs, most of them talk about the agility being a bigger factor, and we don't measure agility particularly well, even though we can measure height and weight particularly well. So I don't know about that. And when I talk to guys who are actually doctors and physiologists or whatever it is that, fix the body and stuff, they don't seem to agree that running back is like a more physical in the way that we typically think about it, in terms of those high impact hits. For a variety of different reasons. One that a doctor told me once is that if you're a running back, you can anticipate and prepare for a hit a lot more often than if you're a wide receiver or a tight end running on the open field trying to avoid being hit. Now, obviously, there's specific context into all of those, and I'm not pretending to understand the body mechanics in any of this. All I'm simply pointing out is that there is much more complication into the idea that running backs have to be big and muscular and dense and thick. I mean, that sounds right, and it's true largely. Good running backs fit that description, almost to a T, but our understanding of why is kind of a narrative. So that's my understanding of, we're looking at physical metrics because there's a threshold range where most running backs operate. But explaining why is weird. Some guys are just built differently and can be smaller, take more punishment, and also the type of punishment you might take might depend more on the type of runner you are, and you could actually take better hits or not as painful or unexpected hits playing running back than playing other positions. And so the relationship that me as a nerd who will never do anything nearly as physically dangerous as play football can't quite get. And so me discussing whether he's big enough, it's kind of a red herring. Red herrings isn't the term, but there's problems there. I'm just saying, think it through for yourself. And that's where my thoughts take me. But if we do just stick with the 200-pound criteria, because it does make some sort of sense, although again I don't really know why. I can't really prove to you why. What I did is looked at some running backs with at least top 24 seasons under 200 pounds. Now, interestingly, the names that turn up on the list are who you expect. They're not Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey. They're Naheem Hines, Andre Ellington, I insist was good and got injured. Again, your mind wants to go to, oh, he's smaller, he got injured, and I'm not sure the science bears that out, as far as I understand the science. But, if that does it for you, fine, but I can't say that's why. Dion Lewis obviously crops up as a small guy, tiny guy running back. Interesting enough, Ronnie Hillman, who I can't ever remember being discussed as a small guy, 3rd round pick, and never quite made it or did anything really significant. That's why top 24, I tried to make it fantasy relevant, but not the fantasy relevant guys, just trying to capture everyone I could. And Ray Rice, interestingly enough, and the other interesting name that turned up on the list, all of them are interesting, but is Ahmad Bradshaw. I don't remember thinking of either of those as tiny guys, and that's the first thing I want to point out to you about Kenny Gainwell. He's under 200 pounds and 71 inches tall, or 5'11". These guys were less than 5'11" and under 200 pounds, Bradshaw and Ray Rice, at the combine. That's when these measurements were taken. They did not play at that weight. They were not tiny guys in terms of weight by the time they were on the field. They were big, husky, muscular, thick guys, as we typically like. And that's the way we kind of saw them as well. But both of them were shorter. They put on weight as they went to the NFL, because they needed more weight, or they felt like they needed more weight, or if the NFL felt like they needed more weight, whatever it is, they did put on more weight and played at a higher weight. That's one of the weird things about judging players by size. Height, maybe, I get, but if we're judging by height, then Kenny Gainwell isn't a small guy, and if we're going by weight, well, we know that can change. Now, we could ask questions about, can Kenny Gainwell, does his frame sustain more weight? And if I know, man, I don't know. Kenny Gainwell knows if he'll play better or play as well with 20 more pounds. I mean, I'm sure there's some nerd somewhere who can explain the body mechanics of it, and that some people can and can't, but it ain't me. And I think if we start guessing at it, we're probably just going to be saying what we want to be true. So I'm staying away from it. What I can tell you is he's probably not going to play in the NFL at 196 pounds, even if that's what he weighs right now. And because we don't have combine metrics, it's really hard to say. I know he's 5'11". I don't know for sure. We always put a little asterisk on pro day numbers, and the internet lies to us constantly. But let's pretend he's around 5'11". Now, so I think he's going to put on weight and get close into that 200 pounds if he gets on an NFL team, and if he's wants to, like, I don't know the man at all. Maybe he doesn't want to. I don't know. But assuming he goes to the NFL, and assuming he puts on a little weight, because that's what all of these guys did who measured under 200 pounds before they get to the NFL, it's kind of unfair to compare him to this list. Now, there are good players on this list, like Ahmad Bradshaw and Ray Rice. In terms of fantasy, they're good. Other stuff, especially on that last one, different kind of question. But Dion Lewis was an incredibly electric scat back there for New England for one season. Ronnie Hillman showed potential. At least I know a lot of people who watch football who are like, yeah, he's got potential. And it never really worked out for him, even behind Monty Ball, which turned out not to be such a big obstacle. Andre Ellington, I do have my own opinion on that. I think he showed some significant talent, but got injured, and then David Johnson. So it's really hard to know how his career works out, and I don't blame any player for injury, and I'm really unsure saying that because he was smaller he got injured. I'm not going to say it. You say it. If you know that for a fact, you go ahead. I try and stick to what I know for sure. I don't know that for sure. Naheem Hines is very much more of a pass catcher, but we've seen him be great for fantasy in the NFL as an undrafted guy. And that's the other thing to note about these, especially since Gainwell is from a low drafted conference. None of these guys got draft capital. Like Andre Ellington was a 6th round pick, if memory serves. Yeah, and he was probably the one that got the most note before that season started, where he eventually got David Johnson. Naheem Hines actually got some of the highest draft capital here in the 4th round. There's a couple of 3rd round guys with Hillman who didn't work out. Steve Slayton, who I honestly don't know much about. Then you've got Ahmad Bradshaw as potentially, arguably the best running back in this group. You've got 7th round draft capital. None of them were first 3 round guys. Well, some were first 3 round picks, but they don't look like that. The NFL doesn't like under 200-pound guys at the combine, and so that kind of feeds back into the narrative. Gainwell's probably not going to get draft capital, guys. I hope the NFL is able to take a swing on him in one of these 3rd, 4th rounds, because I would like them to actually be paying attention, because I definitely think his actual production on the field indicates this guy's got some talent, but I suck at running back. I've said it before. Maybe not. Right? Go watch him. Go listen to what Ray says. But I definitely think his statistical profile bears out the fact that the man's got game if he can get some opportunity. Now, the game with running backs in this kind of potential draft capital tier is he's going to like all of these guys did, get drafted behind someone. You're going to have to watch to see if he gets opportunity. He's going to play on the back of your bench in fantasy for a while, and you hope that somehow an opportunity opens up, and those electric skills we believe are there can shine, and hopefully you build into that. But that also means you have a lower, longer term ceiling for a position that has a lower career arc in fantasy, even for the best of them. So there's limited dynasty value if all that comes true. Now, if the NFL pays more attention than that, we adjust everything I just said doesn't really apply anymore, but that's where my expectation is right now. And that deserves to be said, even if I don't think he's on Team Small Guy. I think the NFL, especially since he's coming off the tape to Zach as Team Small Guy, I think they're going to do similar things to him that they did with some of these players. And hopefully he can hit those heights, like of play at least, of Ray Rice and Ahmad Bradshaw. Now, the other thing I want to point out is if we don't go by weight, and I think it's fair to, especially with the opinion that the NFL is going to have of him, if we don't go by weight and in fact go by height, so we bring in my height group here, 71 inches tall, or 5'11" is the actual measurement, then the players that stick in my mind as having comparable stats or have higher draft capital. And that's, again, what you mean by small guy. Now, I do think he is, because he's coming off the tape that way to Zach, and I think Ray said a similar thing as well. But in terms of comparable stats, all of those guys have more draft capital. Miles Sanders is around 5'11" and around 200 pounds. Now, I don't know if or how much weight Kenny Gainwell will gain if he gets drafted and where he gets drafted, but these guys are all within around 10 pounds, 10, 12 pounds of where we think Kenny think. I did air quotes. That's how much I hate combine stuff. Of where we think Kenny Gainwell is, and they have the same height measurement that we think Kenny Gainwell has. I put on 10 pounds, like, easy. 10 pounds is a good meal. 10 pounds is the difference between last week and this week for me. I don't know about you, but I don't think 10 pounds is out of the realm of possibility for a running back who's probably aware, because he knows more about football than me, that he needs to be heavy if the NFL to take a shot on him or to play in the NFL, if in fact that's the truth. So yeah, he's probably working on it, and like Bradshaw or like Ray Rice, he's probably going to add weight before we even see him drafted. He's probably heavier now than what we think he is. So that's my assumption. If you don't run with me on that, then none of this matters. But if you do, then these guys actually physically in weight and height actually compare more to Gainwell with similar level of above conference level stats. And that's Miles Sanders, Ronald Jones, Marlon Mack, CJ Spiller, and Chris Johnson. Now you'll notice Marlon Mack has 4th round capital. He does compare to him, interestingly enough, in terms of weight and height, and they stand out in terms of being more productive than most players coming from that conference. So Marlon Mack might be the best comparison, and I don't think anyone else is going to make that comparison to him, because Marlon Mack didn't play like he was on Team Small Guy. Some people might have mentioned his height and weight, but that's not the way he played. That wasn't predominant. Whatever. At the front of their mind when they described how he played. To my mind, I can't remember anyone describing him as playing small, So probably a bad comparison in the way they play, but in terms of his actual height and weight that I imagine he'll be playing at, he's actually fairly well, and both were overproductive in a low-drafted conference, and that's an interesting comparable to me, even if they do play differently. And Miles Sanders, get it out your head. You're not getting, second-round draft capital is the dream. He is interesting in that Gainwell also got around 70% of his total yards in those two, technically, but really just one season, through the rushing game. On average, top 12 running backs gain around 81% of their yards from the rushing game. That essentially means that Gainwell is getting a larger receiving role, and I think around 14% of his touches came from the receiving game, and the average is again around 9%. So, he was more of a receiver than most. That's a good thing, because we like PPR points, and tells you that he was playing a slightly different role than most, than we expect top 12 running backs to do in the NFL, but we're really not shooting for top 12 draft capital at this point. And if he's taken earlier in the draft, if the NFL is able to adjust for his potential a little bit more than I suspect right now, we could potentially put him on a Miles Sanders list, but I don't think so. I think that's fairly unfair. But again, in terms of height, that's within his weight range, so he would have a similar BMI, and he is on team small guy. Miles Sanders is someone who, when people talk about how he plays, talk about his size, much more so than a Marlon Mack. So to me, that means at least Sanders' role in the NFL is within Kenny Gainwell's range of outcomes. But again, this is all, he's going to probably have a lot less draft capital. He's not going to be drafted to try and take that role like Miles Sanders was. So my expectation of him getting there is lower. But I really do think, like, his production on the field suggests, as well as Miles Sanders' production on the field suggested, that he could be decent in that role in the NFL, but he's also playing at a lower conference and everything else I said. Let's do some quick comparisons there, because I actually haven't. Yeah, like 17% of his overall touches, Gainwell that is, actually came from the receiving game or were actual receptions instead of rushing attempts. That's a very high number. Again, I can't remember what the average is, but I know it's significantly below 17%. Miles Sanders, 8% of his touches came from the receiving game. He went to the NFL being thought of as more of a small guy receiving back, so that tells you how much more Gainwell was being used in the receiving game in his situation than Sanders was. This was a more predominantly receiving back than most, but it's still 70% of his yards coming from the rushing game means he was rushing, and talking with Zach about it, he was a surprisingly good rusher. I think that's what I took away from what Zach told me of it, in that you might, because he's coming across as a small guy, you might be surprised by how well he rushes up the middle, as it were. And so that's interesting as well. Don't think he compares well to Ronald Jones in terms of the role he had. Ronald Jones had 4% of his touches from the receiving game, which is below average for good running backs, and one of the concerns we had with Ronald Jones coming in. CJ Spiller never really met any kind of potential in the NFL, but Gainwell actually compares better to him in terms of the split of touches that he was getting in college, which is interesting. Spiller also got much more significant draft capital, if memory serves, and then I'm telling you we should probably expect. Yeah, he was drafted in the first round. Chris Johnson, I mean, he had a similar split of touches in college compared to Gainwell as well. Both of those players, Spiller and Johnson, had 16% of the touches coming in the receiving game, or were receptions over rushing attempts. But both got first-round draft capital, and Chris Johnson tore up the damn combine with, like, the fastest running back score. I think it still is the fastest time, or no, I think it's second now. But for a running back, like, that's, we're not going to get that for Gainwell, so, and I don't think he would, he's not Chris Johnson in terms of speed, you know, but he's fast enough. What else was I going to look at here? I was going to point out you some of the ways that 70% and that 14% work. Where we do know we're looking at one season, even though it's fair to, especially with running back. It does bear notice that, like, most of those players' percentages in terms of touches varied somewhat wildly in terms of how much they were getting from the rushing game, how much receiving work. Gainwell's 1 year at age 20, 56% of the team's rushing yards. Now, that's comparable to Jones, who had 59% in his highest production year, and Chris Johnson, who had 54% in his first year. His height was 61%, but it's within the range. You can see how he was taking on the full role in that conference for that year. But you also notice, hopefully with these other players, that they range. Like Johnson had 20% 1 year, presumably because of an injury or an off-field issue, and then it goes up to 60%. If we look at Spiller, who pretty much had the typical career path, like a Travis Etienne, frankly, of slowly having a good role to start, but then building into the full role, you see it goes from 33% all the way up to 49% of the team's rushing yards. So that's actually positive for Gainwell, because he was more of a rushing yards guy for his team than Spiller ever was, and Spiller kind of busted. But you can see how that average is made up of multiple numbers. With Gainwell, we don't know the full story. His next year could have been up to 65, or it could have stayed down, what he did at age 20, or it could have bottomed out and he'd become more of a receiver, like kind of what we see with Miles Sanders' profile here, where he's 7% rushes, 8% rushes, and 48% of the team's rushing yards. So we don't know how his career would have played out. And that age 19 season on Gainwell, again, he wasn't really playing. He was 2% of the team's rushing attempts, but if I remember, he only played 4 games. And anything below 6, I don't even really considering. So, but it's worth noting, right, that that 14% of his touches being from the receiving game and 70% of his yards coming from the rushing game. That's in one single year. Now, it's fair to judge him on that year and say that he did well and therefore he's probably good. That's what I'm doing. But if we see his career played out, maybe it would have come more into line with that 85-9% split I was talking about. We don't know. So that's a question mark we have about the type of role he might go into the NFL. And that's all with a big freaking asterisk of the NFL's probably not going to draft this guy highly, if at all. But I really think they should. I think he's a dynamic player. Again, top 10 in yards adjusted weighted yards per team pass attempt, which is a really good metric for running backs in his best year, which is his only year. And if you sort by best year, some really good running backs turn up at the top of that list. So even adjusting for conference and looking at a stat that's particularly good at expressing how productive they were on their opportunities for that team, adjusted by conference, because he was on a low conference, he was actually real good. He has a high receiving game, which we always look for these days because, as Zachary was saying on that live stream, like Derrick Henry had pretty much the best rushing season anyone's ever produced and was still below receiving backs just because of the amount of value we get in our silly little fantasy game from the receiving game. So we're always looking for targets. And that also gives him somewhat of a floor and potential for opportunity, like a Nyheim Hines, to go back to that other list, because he can always get some work in the receiving game. I think he has that skill set just based on the amount of volume. Bearing in mind we're only looking at one season, we don't know how it works out if we see multiple seasons. But I do think he's a very different receiver, and that was kind of backed up by what Zach said as well. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is none of these guys are who I wanted to turn up when I started looking. The guy that I had in mind, that turned up in my mind, because I've been on team Giovanni Bernard since, the day he came into the league. Now, Gio got draft capital. He got second-round draft capital, which, again, isn't going to be Kenny's thing, but that's who I kind of think of. One, with the way Zach was describing him, he plays like a small player. That's what I was getting from Zach. Surprisingly good at running the ball, though. That fits a Gio description. Epically or effectively productive, above average, whether you look at pass running backs or adjusting for conference. That fits my knowledge of Giovanni Bernard's profile. More of a receiver in college than a rusher. Well, no, a higher level receiver than most going into the league. Yeah, 17%, much like Gainwell's touches from Giovanni Bernard, came from the receiving game in college, and he only played 2 years, which means I have a better average to look at, but also reminded me of Kenny Gainwell. So, to me, even though those aren't the players that pop up when I look at weight and height, and certainly not when I think of draft capital, to me, I think he's probably going to be a lower drafted Giovanni Bernard comp. That's my hope. And I get it. You're like, I don't like Giovanni Bernard. One, hater. No, but I seriously love Giovanni Bernard. I don't watch football, but if I did, some of my favorite moments might have been watching Giovanni Bernard run. I just think he's really good. And as a receiver, I don't watch, obviously, so I'm just using his stats for this comparison. But I think he's actually one of the most talented receivers. Not ever or in the league or anything, but I think he's an incredibly talented receiver. And I'm hoping that's kind of in Gainwell's stat based on that one season he played in college as well. But who knows? But that's who comes to mind when I think of Kenny Gainwell. It's not a comp. It's just, there's my thought. That's who comes to my mind. A lower drafted Giovanni Bernard, who I think can provide fantasy relevance. Definitely, has upside, but we're going to probably have to play the waiting game, and he's probably going to get low draft capital and everything else I said. So this video is a lot longer than I thought. I probably should have seen this coming, because players I like or don't like tend to get... I just keep talking, but that's where I am on him. Let me know what you think. Comments below. Hit up Zach Reed on Twitter at Tacit Assassin, or on his podcast at Dynasty Dummies if you want more of an in-depth film take on him, or Ray GQ here on YouTube. Not that I haven't done a podcast with Ray recently. I just happen to know he's good, and he's been watching these players a lot longer than I have been looking at their stats, so he's definitely an opinion to check out. Yeah, appreciate you all. Thanks very much. Let me know what you think, and also Gio for life. That's it. That's all I got. Yeah, take care. I'm out. Bye. Everything else, I gotta come up with an ending for these. I don't have one. It's just me saying I need an ending. That's how I end these videos. I hope you have a good day. How's that? Bye.
Do you have the time to listen to me?